Good morning. What a pleasure to be with all of you today. So all the TED advice suggests that speakers should collect data to sort of support our claims. And I thought it would be great if I did that live. So you guys are going to help me collect our data right now, okay? So I hope you're ready. I want to see with a show of hands how many people here have grandparents who grew up in a country different than the one you're currently living in. Whoa. I don't need to ask any more questions. How many of you have parents who grew up in a country different than the one you're currently living in? Okay. How many of you have ever lived in more than one country? Okay, now this next one is crucial, so you have to think thoroughly and answer correctly. How many of you have ever engaged with, had sustained conversation with, worked with, been in friendship with, someone from a different culture or country than your own? Okay, this is brilliant. I'm getting off the stage. This is brilliant. All of you know something about worlds colliding. You all know something about what it's like to engage with someone from a different culture than yours. Someone who does life a little differently, simply because of the way they were raised. So whether we like it or not, the cultures we were raised in and are continually raised in have a huge impact on how we make our ways through the world. Sometimes, a lot of the times, that sort of cultural collision is external, and sometimes, and it seems like this could apply to a lot of us here, it's internal, where there are cultures sort of vying for our attention internally because we've been raised by part of so many different ones. When people ask me where I'm from, I'm usually completely stumped. I was born in New York. I have parents of African and Italian heritage. I went to junior high in the Ivory Coast. I went to high school in Oxford, England. I've lived in many different cities in the United States. I've spent significant time in Bolivia and Paris. And most recently, I'm sort of transitioning to Abuja, Nigeria. So I kind of know about cultures colliding. And what I've discovered is that just as much as different geographical spaces can invite us to engage the world and experience the world differently, it's the same thing with cultural spaces. Every culture has a strong narrative suggestion of what it means to make our way in the world. And I'm discovering that the more I have a posture of humility and curiosity towards these different collisions, whether internal or external, the more likely I am to develop sort of new layers of myself, to recognize them, layers that I may not have recognized before simply because of lack of invitation. So what I'm learning is that cultural collision can move from challenge to open invitation. Now, I can only speak from my experience as a woman, and it's not earth-shattering news that every sort of culture or country has its own sort of working definition and stereotype of what it means to be a woman and how women should be. So just out of curiosity, I did a Google search on iconic women from different countries. And in addition to the Google search, I also sent out a survey to about maybe 2.5 dozen women within 10 countries on 3 continents. And I wanted to know how they would describe women from the various countries in which I Googled. So, voila. Iconic American women. Now, the survey responses to this question was that American women are typically assertive, fiercely independent, really vocal about not needing a man to succeed. But they're also very conscious about their body image and seeking perfection in all areas of their lives. Iconic British women. The responses to this survey were that British women tend to be very self-deprecating, very brash. Apparently, you guys are heavy drinkers. But you're socially and you're socially and class conscious, and you're extremely proud of being from Britain. Iconic French woman. Now, the survey responses to this are that French women are very sexually open, somehow know the secrets of what it means to be a woman, don't really care what other people think about them, and of course, extremely stylish and effortlessly fashionable. The iconic African woman. This was actually hysterical because most of the images that came up were of African American women. It wasn't until I got a bit more specific and I put in iconic Nigerian woman that I got a random image of a woman who apparently is dressed, well, you can see that she's sort of dressed in tribal wear. The survey responses to this question, which were typically from non-African women, were that African women tend to be big nurturers. We can get a little from a lot, and we're super concerned with supporting our family and making do. Now, most of these images, I think we can put this, iconic Afghanistan women. I put this in simply out of curiosity because so often when we think of women from different cultures, we sort of have the set ones, right? French, Italian, American, British, European. And the image we see tend to be beautiful and glamorous. But I put this in because there are women in so many other parts of the world that we often forget. And I thought it was fascinating that the image that came up for iconic Afghanistan women, who here knows this image? It's from National Geographic, back in the 80s. So, the images in the survey responses, they're a bit stereotypical. And we all know that stereotypes come from some modicum of truth, right? But the other truth is that stereotypes never give us the full answer. And I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, when we engage with cultures different from our own, we usually do so, good or bad, we usually do so with some sort of prejudgment, some sense of what is right and what's wrong. But I wonder how many of us enter into these cultural collisions on a daily basis, wondering what we can learn from a people or a place completely different from ours. I tend to think that each cultural narrative can offer us sort of a distinctly new way of being in the world. But I also think that there's sort of an ethos to each place that can have a big influence in how we sort of tell our own personal narratives and the stories that we pay attention to. A couple of summers ago, or years ago, I spent significant time in Paris doing work. And I always look back at that time in Paris as sort of this as though I received an invitation from the city to just dwell in the beauty and gift and joy of being a woman, simply for a woman's sake. Paris is a city that has an ethos of sensuality, and not just in a sexual way. Sensuality in the sense that we're really encouraged to use all our senses to engage the world. A very somewhat different experience from coming of age as a woman in the American South. I was born in New York, but I spent a significant amount of my early adult years living in the South, in the southern part of the country. And there is a pervading ethos there that's really steeped in racial tension that is part of the history of that country. And I will never forget going to a friend's graduation party. And at the party, in her apartment, when you walked in, her family was sort of lined up like a receiving line at a wedding. And each guest walked in, shook hands of everyone. So I walked in, I shake her mother's hand, her father's hand, her brother's hand, and I get to her grandmother, this elderly white woman, southern white woman. And I put out my hand and smile. And she looks me dead in the face, looks at my hand, and completely ignores me. And the thing is, this is the only thing I remember about that party. And I'll call my friend Catherine. Catherine and I never talked about this. And I bring this story up simply to say that there do exist cultural narratives that try to get us to believe lies about ourselves and about humanity. And what can be a very challenging and painful sort of cultural collision can also be an invitation if you look hard enough. And for me, the invitation from that experience was to learn to discern truth from lies about me and about others. As I've said, I'm spending more and more time in Africa, or in Nigeria. And the beauty of traveling so much and getting to live in different countries is I'm constantly reminded that there are so many narratives about how to make our ways in the world. There are so many stories in which I can find myself a part of. But it's not always cut and dry. My mother's in the audience, and she'll probably laugh at this. But I'm starting to spend more and more time in Nigeria. And I'm realizing that it took me maybe about a month to realize that the fact that I'm a single, independent, somewhat assertive young woman was having a direct impact in how people receive me in the country. Attributes like independence, ambitiousness, self-assertiveness that I had learned to celebrate in other cultures, mainly Western cultures that I was raised in, are not necessarily seen as attributes that women should celebrate in the country I'm currently living in. If anything, it could be more of a hindrance to why I still am single there. But I like to think I'm still thriving. But the flip side of this, the invitation of this, is that this cultural emphasis on marriage and family is actually opening up spaces within me that's allowing me to sort of name and own the desires I have for these roles, to name and own them in a way that perhaps in another culture I might be seen as not having enough ambition or being weak. So I'm learning to hold these things in tension. And in all the ways these cultural collisions are happening in my life, both internally and externally, it's really causing me to look at, especially women, but all people, to embrace and look and engage with women from other cultures with more curiosity and with more genuine interest. Around this, maybe about a year and a half ago, no, this time last year, I was in Paris promoting one of my books, and it happened to be a collection of essays in which American women talk about issues they consider really important in their lives, but their faith tradition doesn't talk about enough. When the talk was over, a young Muslim woman walked up to me. She was dressed from head to toe covered, and she was wearing hijab, the head and neck covering, and she was clutching the book to her. And she came up to me, and she was so excited, and she just told me, "I can't wait to read the rest of these essays." During our conversation, I'll call her Wadad. During our conversation, I learned that she was from Yemen and in Paris getting an education. And I just had to ask her, what would make you come to this talk that's specifically about Christian American women? And I'll never forget what she said to me. She looked at me, she smiled, and she said, "I'm Muslim, but I'm a lady, right? And a lady is a lady." And she said, "I was just really curious to know how if there were any overlaps between what American Christian women and Muslim women from my part of the world consider really important issues to talk about." And the more Wadad and I talked in that conversation, the more we realized we actually did have in common. For most of our lives, we had both been seeking to find our own authentic voices amidst cultural narratives and traditions that were trying so hard to tell us that there was only one way to be a woman in the world. And I often think back to this conversation because it's such a reminder to me of how women from different people from different cultures can teach us so much about how to make our ways in the world that before now we may not have thought about. It reminds me that we actually need one another. And I think about Wadad, who has grown up with this sense of, who's grown up with the recognition that there's something both beautiful and sacred in the space she creates around her body by the veiling of it. And it's made me think, as a woman reared mostly in the West, where the unveiling of our bodies tends to be how we define ourselves, what would it look like for me to think about the space I make for my own body, both externally and internally, by the veiling or unveiling of it? It's given me a completely new perspective. Now I recognize that I'm from a certain socioeconomic class. I can't deny that. And I can't deny that, of course, that affects also the ways in which I culturally collide with others. So the challenge for someone like me is to continually think of what are ways that women from other cultures and from other socioeconomic spaces within those cultures, what are ways that I can learn from them and they can learn from me? I kind of think about it as this invitation to be kind of a cultural third dimension to one another, like really opening up new worlds of what it could mean to see ourselves in one another's cultures. And I really wonder, if we truly began to see ourselves in one another, I started wondering, what impact would that have in how we work towards creating healing and more just spaces for each other? I did ask Wadad if she had the opportunity to write an essay, what would she have written about? And she said she would have written about how much she hates people asking her about wearing hijab, because she usually gets such hateful, judgmental comments. So naturally, I asked her how she felt about wearing hijab. And it was almost as though I'd asked her about a loved one, because her complete demeanor changed. And she said wearing hijab for her reminds her of the values by which she wants to carry out her life here, and it prepares her for her afterlife. And then she said that growing up, her mother had always told both her and her sister that a woman in hijab is like a wrapped piece of chocolate, secret, special, waiting to be discovered. As I said, I'm spending more and more time in Nigeria, and the work that I do there puts me in direct contact with impoverished Nigerian girls who are in poorly resourced schools. And I'm starting to see them differently the more time I spend in that culture, a culture that should be mine, but because of my own internal cultural collisions, I'm still learning to see myself in. And the more I try to look for ways this culture reflects back to me parts of myself I haven't paid attention to, I haven't seen as important, the more I'm seeing these girls as individuals, not as a collective. And the more it's making me wonder, what would it mean to recognize myself as part of the larger human condition in a way that changes the way I work towards seeking more equitable spaces for these girls? In the few months that I've been living in Nigeria, I think I've done more research on the plight of Nigerian girls than I ever imagined I would. And the question now is, what do I do with that information? How is this particular cultural collision going to affect how I engage with the rest of the world? And I know that I've made this talk through the lens of being a woman in the world, but I also know that it has much broader implications for all of us as human beings. And I think the challenge for all of us is to think about the vastly different lives with which ours collide, and to begin to see that difference, not as something to judge or to assess or to qualify, but to see it as opportunity and as deep invitation to discover more not only about yourself, but about how you relate to the world. And it may seem like sort of a vain way to go about it, but the truth is, as human beings, we tend to relate the best with people we have similarities to. So the challenge is to look for glimpses of ourselves in one another, glimpses of ourselves in worlds that at first might seem vastly different and far away from us. And once we start to see those glimpses, fallen human beings as we are, it's only natural to want what is most life-affirming, what is most just, what is most true for those to whom you recognize as simply extensions of yourselves. Thank you.